Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to discuss, is my flow hive ready to harvest? Now what we have in this area is not a lot of honey, and I can tell that as an experienced beekeeper because of the patterns in the windows. So what I want to show you here is what it looks like when your bees are a little bit hungry. So I'm looking in here and you can see that underneath the bees' feet, give us a thumbs up if you can see the comb beneath the bees' feet. And you can see that it has some wax capping on it, showing you that that honey is ready. But over empty cells, or cells that are partly full, showing that this frame was full and they ate some honey away because they've gotten a bit hungry. Better on the other side of the hive here. So again, what we've got is a pattern that you learn to recognise where you've got a whole lot of empty. And that means the best your flow hive. It's just a little bit of honey in the frames. So if you're not sure whether you can harvest, you're a bit worried the bees are a bit hungry and they need those supplies for you have in your hive, or just part of one frame. Here's down there. If we go across, you can actually see this one is still full of honey, which is neat. So that's the one we're going to questions. Put it in the comments below. We'll get to. Let's just harvest a small. I've got our little tube here, that tongue. Is our jar underneath that tube, and is their carbohydrate. That is what keeps them going. Pollen is the protein, nectar is their carbohydrate. So if you're not sure, leave the honey for the bees. You will get amazing filling patterns where you see a lot of honey forming in the ends, and you'll actually see it changing day by day, and you see nectar glinting in the windows and then the capping going on. When that's happening, you can harvest quite a lot of honey, and your season ebbs and flows with how much nectar is available in the flowers. Bees will be foraging up to 10 kilometres to get that nectar. But when there's an abundance close by, then the bees can really bring it home, store a lot of honey. Lucky for us, they store more than they need, and we can share some too. Look at that honey just pouring out. Isn't that a beautiful sight to see? Lovely. So if you've got any questions, sing out.
Will do, Seeds. We had a bit of a glitch going on there, but I think we seem to be all right now, so give us a thumbs up if we're rolling again. Cedar.
So one flow frame will give you about 6 or 7 of these jars. These are 3. Harvest the whole when the frame is nice and full. Sometimes you'll find a 2-litre jar, if you leave it there long enough, will even overflow. Now have a look what's happening here. Every now and then we've got a little globule coming out. See that little jelly globule? That means we've got the medicinal leptospermum honey in here, which is Australian manuka, if you like. So that's worth a lot per kilogram, and it's also a great one if you see a lot of that going into your jar. Put that jar aside, leave it on the shelf for medicinal purposes, for wound care, because it's proven medically to really help stubborn wounds that won't heal, and often doctors are turning to honey these days when the antibiotic creams aren't working. So pretty cool. I'm just going to get another jar here and swap that over. Isn't that beautiful honey? I want to taste that. There we go. Some medicinal honey with the thixotropic properties. Now thixotropic properties are interesting because they're a jelly-like structure that forms, but when you stir it up it turns liquid and then it sets like jelly again. So if you've got a lot of it in your frame, it actually will come out very slowly in big globules, and sometimes it can even not come out at all, or the jelly will stay in the frame more so. So it really depends. It's pretty unusual to get 100% of that thixotropic honey in your frame though. Now I can actually see it here if you look at this pattern close in, I can see that actually some jellies stayed in the frame, and it's going to take some time to come down. Beautiful.
Great.
Questions?
See, Lisa's asking, recently did a harvest from the Flow Hive and the honey is very sweet and runny. Just wondering if that is normal.
So the viscosity does vary a lot, and also how sweet it is an interesting way to describe it. And some honeys taste really sweet and others taste more tangy. And there's so much variation. It all depends on what flower source the bees are going for, because there's as many different flavours and colours of honey as there is flowers that produce nectar in the world. So there's such a big variety, and it's often a unique honey in your area, because you might get a combination of this palm tree and that rainforest species coming together to form a beautiful honey that you can enjoy. So it's often the best honey in the world is the honey you get right from your area. But as far as how liquid it is go, now this is warm, it's come straight out of the hive, so it's going to be more liquid. As it cools, it'll but it will thicken up and behave more like you imagine honey to behave. If it's really runny and it's cooled down and it's really quite liquid in the jar, then it's possible that there's a too high moisture content. That can be tested with an apparatus called a refractometer, which uses the refraction of light to tell the sugar levels in the honey. But generally, if it's really liquid, it's probably higher than that 18-20% range that we want in terms of water content. And what you need to do is either consume that or keep it in the fridge to make it last. But honey that has that low water content will actually last a very long time. In fact, there's been honey found 3,000 years old in the Egyptian tombs that is still good. So if the bees have done their job and gotten that water content low, and you've harvested it when it's nice and ripe, meaning they've put their capping on, and then you should have honey that can last a very long time, provided the lid stays on or you're in a very dry climate. Because if you leave the lid off, moisture from the air will absorb into the honey, increase that water content, and fermentation will likely occur. And then you'll have to make mead out of it. Not the end of the world, but if it's turning into mead, you may as well go with it. Beautiful.
Nice. So, we've got a question coming in saying, when I open up the back window, you can't see that it's full of honey, but when I've inspected my flow frames, they're all capped off, but it's like the end is not, like you can't tell that there's honey in the frame. Can I still harvest it?
The answer is yes. If you've inspected and you can see that your frames are nice and capped, then go ahead and harvest, even though you're not seeing it in the window there. A few reasons for that. One is they just might have run out of the honey flow and not quite gotten to the window yet, even though they've stored an enormous amount of honey in the hive. Or you can sometimes get genetic traits that do that. They just don't like filling to the extremities of the frame. So if that's a persistent thing and they never fill that, then you can either recognise that that's what they do, like you've done and you've inspected and you've learnt that they actually are full. Using the side windows can help you identify that. But we did have a hive once that would never fill the windows, but most beehives do, so genetics plays a role in that as well.
Great, and maybe following on from that seed, Vanessa's asking, has a flow hive, and when it peeks through the viewing window, 99% of the comb is capped with just the odd open hex shape empty. She's just wondering, would this be just a sign of the bees having a feed?
Yes, that means that they've filled it up, they've gotten onto a good flow, they've filled it all up, the honey flow's stopped, and they're uncapping and eating a couple of the cells of honey, which means that the honey flow stopped and they are consuming a bit. So that's okay. If you've got a lot of honey in the hive, just harvest some, leave the rest for the bees, and just keep an eye out for when the nectar's returning again. If you have a look around this side, you can actually see, luckily, that there's something flowering again. We're in our late summer here, and often it's a time with not many flowers. But you can see something's flowering because there's some nectar glistening in the bottom of those cells. Give us the thumbs up if you can see that. And also let us know whereabouts in the world you're tuning in from. So that area there has nectar glistening in the bottom, but up here it's still dry. They've eaten the honey out. The cells look nicely coated in wax and all the parts are joined together. It's waiting for honey, but there just isn't enough nectar to really fill it all at the moment. But that'll change. The seasons are always changing. And here we have a sort of, if you graft it, it would be the winter time. Whereas we get quite good honey in the winter time as well. So it really depends where you are.
Thanks, Seeds. I think we just had a little glitch then. It might be when Callum ducks behind the hive, maybe. Anyway, hopefully we're all back on again. Chris is calling in from Gawler in South Australia and began with a little swarm in December. But every time they inspect the hive, they're finding cockroaches in the roof. Just wondering, is it okay to set cockroach baits near the hive?
Okay, so cockroach baits will be an insecticide. What you want to avoid is them getting wet and that insecticide flowing onto the bees. I wouldn't worry about cockroaches under the roof. You could just brush them out and keep doing that and they'll eventually go. They will not get into the hive, they won't bother the hive, they'll only be in the outside parts, like maybe in the tray or under the roof. So I wouldn't go putting insecticide traps for cockroaches there. You could just brush them away. You could dust some cinnamon powder in there, which might help just to deter them a little bit, but I would avoid the cockroach traps in the hive.
Great, thanks. And with the, also asking on the same question, with the ant guards, what do you put in the ant guards to stop other, like ants and things, getting up into the hive?
Okay, we just usually use a bit of oil. Now, ants can be a bit persistent. They can often be under the roof behind the covers. So if you want to get rid of ants, the recipe is, now I say get rid of ants, but they will come back again. It's just when they need a drier home, they'll crawl up to higher ground. And it's a nice little spot to nest behind the window covers and so on. So they won't bother the bees. It's more of a cosmetic issue for us, that it's just annoying to see a whole bunch of ants crawling around when you open the window. But what we do with out of underneath the roof, and also don't forget the key access cover, then that jar's filling up but still got a little bit of time. Go ahead and keep harvesting, but for the purposes of the exercise, let's just harvest a little bit of honey and leave the rest for the bees. Back to the ant guards. So this is an ant barrier, which you can create however you like, but this is a nice way to do it. Next thing you do is get the foliage away from the hives, because you can create a barrier, but the foliage touching the ants will just climb up any leaves or flowers that are touching the hive. Screw that lid down again, and what that'll do is make it hard for those ants to bridge that gap. If you've got really big ants, then you'll leave the lid a bit higher. But most ants, you can screw that down like that, and they can't actually get past that oil barrier there. You can also use Vaseline, like a white grease, and put that in here and smear it around underneath as well. That'll last a bit longer than oil, because oil tends to wash out a little bit in the rain. But you probably need to do that a couple of times. Once the ants get the idea that it's a hard home to make, then they'll nick off for a while. And 6 months later they might come back again. You can do the same thing. It's basically how you deal with ants if you want to. Otherwise you can just leave them there.
Yes, because they don't affect the honey, do they, Sid? You've talked about that a little bit with the old ants.
Not at all. The bees will keep them out of the hive. When you open the lid sometimes and do your inspections, you'll notice that a whole bunch of ants might fall into the hive, and you'll watch the bees having a good old tussle with them, and they certainly won't let ants crawl around inside, because they're honey stealers.
Now Margie's calling in, and she's just down the road, down at Coolgardie, which I think is down near Ballina, isn't it? Is that Coolgardie? I'm confused.
Great.
Anyway, Margie's basically saying all her frames are really full once again, pretty excited. Just wondering if they should leave a frame full for the bees, basically to get them through winter, I guess.
Yeah, we've still got a little bit of time, and if you're in this area and you're close to the coast, you'll get probably the paperbarks flowering and topping them up through winter. So if your hive's quite full, I would go ahead and harvest it now and let the bees fill it up in the autumn. And jars on the shelf and allowing the bees some more room to fill it up again. So it's about just noticing when they're filling and when they're hungry. When they're filling it and you've got some full frames, you can keep harvesting and actually store quite a lot of honey that way.
Great. Cedar Williams asking, in what circumstances would you add a second brood box?
So people often add a second brood box in colder regions. We're in a subtropical region here where we hardly get a winter as far as the bees are concerned, and we don't need to store a lot of honey in the hive for a long cold winter like other areas do. But let's say you're down south here in Australia or up north in the US or in Europe, you might consider keeping a whole nother box just for the bees to have enough stores for a long cold, perhaps 6 months of no flowers. So second brood box will help that. Another reason, because they actually store quite a bit of honey in that second brood box, you find it'll mainly be honey spread between the top box and the bottom box on the edges, and the brood either in the middle at the bottom or the middle at the bottom of both, and also the middle of the next brood box as well, with a lot of honey down the side. So it does give them more room to store honey if you decide to take the super off for that winter. Ask your local beekeepers what they do. Ask your local Flow Hive beekeepers as well. You'll get really different opinions there. But another reason why you might add a second brood box is you might want to limit swarming. So let's say springtime is there, making more space in the hive will relieve that primary trigger for swarming, which is not enough space. So adding a second brood box, your hive will be much less likely to swarm in the springtime. You could also add another super instead, or both, and have a tall stack of hive. That's very conventional in beekeeping, is to store a lot of honey on the hive. With flow hives, you can actually run them a lot smaller and store the honey in jars and put them on the shelf instead. So it's a different mentality than conventional beekeeping, where you can keep your boxes if you need to find the queen. Maintain as well, less boxes to store in the shed over the winter time, a lot of produce from, without having to have all of the paraphernalia that comes along with conventional beekeeping. So for that reason I run the hives smaller, and my strategy is just to split in spring. Limits the swarming tendencies by creating space when you take half of the brood frames out and put them in another box.
Right. Paul's asked a question, but I think you've kind of answered it, Cedar, where he was brood box to build up the honey for winter, but you kind of answered that, I think, for Paul as well in that.
You might need to store in your hive for a winter. You can, of course, leave the Flow Super on as honey stores for the winter. Let's say it's half full of honey or full of honey coming into winter, you might just let them consume that. Now, if you're going to do that, take the excluder out so the queen can move with the bees as they consume honey, and the bee ball rises in the hive. Now that's for colder regions. We don't have to do that here. We can leave the super on and the excluder on all year round because we have flowers during the winter time.
One beehive.
Look, it's and also to do your brood inspections, at least a couple of things like AFB. From that, it's a bit of whatever reason, they perhaps get a frame from another hive and put into the bottom and so on. So it's more than that, but keeping a good eye on them is a good idea. Making sure, and they seem to be doing well by the bee numbers, and what you'll need to do is get in there and see why and have a look. And what you'll find is some apprehension in the beginning, and then once you cross that barrier and realise there's this amazing world to get into in beekeeping, is inspecting my hive every couple of weeks too much because I'm really enjoying it? So we hear that a lot as well. Now, in terms of spring management, that's another time in beekeeping. So that's one of the times when you would do your routine brood inspection on the live streams. Take out some of the frames of honey, make some space, or take a split or do some kind of spring management to limit swarming. You might be adding a box like we were talking about earlier, but some way to make a bit more space in the springtime if your bees are really crowded. So you're basically observing, looking for whether there's too many bees or not enough bees, and that's when you might intervene. Otherwise, you're doing your routine, a couple of good brood inspections a year to make sure everything's okay and disease-free in the brood box. Now, if you're from another continent that's got the varroa mite, then you may need to do more things to your hive. So ask local beekeepers, and you might find that you've got to do a bunch of things for that mite in the springtime as well. We have a lot of great information at the beekeeper.org. In fact, there's a special on at the moment which gives you a discount on a yearly membership. And what the beekeeper.org offers is a training course made to take you from square one right through to a deep, even scientific knowledge. Experts from all over the world are contributing. So although we have a lot of bee knowledge here, we don't have all the knowledge for what you might need to do in other parts of the world. So the idea is that course gives you really broad understanding and also stuff specific to your location as well. It gets rave reviews. It's a fundraiser. We've raised enough to plant over 1 million trees now, and the idea is we'll literally be creating billions of safe blossoms for bees to forage on, because in the end it's habitat that they need. It's habitat for not only the European honeybee, your bees will be fine with you inspecting as often as you like. Having said that, steer away from cold, windy, rainy days to do your brood inspections, because the uncapped brood can get a bit of a shock from the cold. So just nice warm sunny days, get in there, have a look, do some learning. It's an amazing way to learn about bees, is to get in there and see what they're doing. Compare that to the next time you look. Do some research, do some learning, have a look at all our online training material. It's either free, or if you really want a good course, thebeekeeper.org. And yeah, learn away, get in there and have a look. Fantastic to hear that you're doing your brood inspections and you're on your way.
Is it possible to do a close-up of the frame where the honey's coming out to see?
All dark like these, when recoating the cell in wax, fixing up all the joins, and the whole process will start again. So I never get sick of watching the honey flow out of the hive. Today we just harvested half a frame to show that's something you can do with a flow hive, is just harvest a little bit of honey, leave the rest for the bees, because the bees in this apiary are a little bit hungry at the moment. They're waiting for some more things to flower. But half the frame's given us 1, 2, 3 and a bit jars so far. So that's beautiful. That's showing that frame was actually fairly full of honey. It's a good thing.
So when you do the harvest and when you finish the harvest, do you always leave the key in there?
During the harvest I do, because the parts can take a while to move sometimes. The propolis and wax is so strong that sometimes you need to leave the key in so we could get the camera in. But normally you just leave that down like that. But what I'll show you now is what we do to reset that frame again. So we want to put the cells back into the cell formed position. What we do is back to a 90, and then the key will easily slide out, and then we're putting it in. Now we may as well go all the way to the back, even though we've only opened half the frame. You'll feel it stop at the back, and the key will be all the way in like that, and then it's just a case of turning that back to a 90 again. And that's pushed all those parts back into the cell form position, from being like that with the honey draining out to being like that, where the bees can then reform the hexagons, connect the wax bridges together, and away they go, refilling. Now, back to your question, I will leave that key in for 30 seconds or a couple of minutes if we can, because just like opening, the parts can be a bit slow to move back into position. If you just do a little quick close like that, you find that some parts will be sitting up like that still, and the bees may not be able to use it, or they might be able to use it but put a whole heap of wax down in the bottom corner, and that can limit the flow of honey next time, cause spills in the hive. and so on. So if you can, just leave that for a minute or two to make sure all those parts reset properly. Good questions.
Yeah, and it is one of those questions we get a lot, isn't it, Cedar, where people think their frames haven't sort of reset, gone back into position.
Yes, and you'll sometimes see it in the side window where you can actually see, and you see some parts sitting up because whoever was harvesting at the time either didn't close it off at all or just gave a quick close and the parts were sitting up a little bit. So a good tip, leave it there for a minute or two to close the frame again. Time for a couple more questions.
A couple more questions, great. Cedar, always the question we're always getting asked, and I can answer that one, what are the size of these jars? And I think these are the 270ml ones, I think they are, or the 250. I know we had some bigger ones as well. So
I think they're the 270 or 280.
Yeah, I think that was what they were.
Yeah, so you get an enormous amount of honey. You can imagine that's half of one of the frames. So if we got 7 out of one frame, then it's 42 of those jars to harvest all of these frames here, and sometimes more. So it's incredible how much honey the bees can store in a hive. And the exciting thing is, when the honey flows on in springtime, a couple of weeks the honey will be back and you can do it all again. Make great presents for all your neighbours to keep them sweet, and also for, you know, come birthdays and Christmases, everyone loves fresh honey.
Especially the Flow office. And we're always getting asked, what do we do with all the honey? But it doesn't seem to last long around here.
No, yes, there's a lot of hungry honey eaters with all of the families that work in the hive. And every now and then we do a collaboration. We did a nice one with Stone and Wood where we harvested a whole lot of honey from my apiary, and we made a honey beer, which was neat. So keep a lookout for those types of collaborations. We might have one coming up.
Ooh, exciting. Cedar, Amber asked, maybe missed the start of it as well, just wondering, how do you know when you've opened only a half frame?
Okay, to open half a frame, just as we were showing in the beginning, in that frame. So if there's the point where the key goes in the maximum way to open half the frame, you just insert the key that far into that opening slot, which is the lower one up here, and turn that, and that will harvest half a frame instead.